Remove that badge from your chest and surrender it to the court. The judge ordered, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. Every whisper stopped. My daughter-in-law sat at the plaintiff's table, with her hands folded and her expression perfectly composed, certain she was watching me lose the last symbol of my 37 years of service. I said nothing. I slowly unclasped the worn fire captain's badge and placed it on the evidence table. Then I turned it over and showed the room the registration code on the back. That number was the first crack. What came after it brought the entire structure down. If you made it this far, thank you, it means everything. Now, tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? You'd be amazed how far this community reaches. Subscribe so you never miss a story that stays with you. Some elements of this story are dramatized for educational purposes. Names and settings are fictional, but the lesson underneath is something I hope you carry with you. My name is Arthur Bennett. I am 63 years old, and for 37 years, I ran into burning buildings for a living. I know how that sounds. People hear it, and they picture something cinematic, a man silhouetted against orange flame jaw set, moving without fear. The truth is quieter than that. Fear was always there. You just learned to put it somewhere useful. You folded it up tight, tucked it behind your sternum, and let it sharpen your focus instead of stealing your legs. That was the job. I joined the Columbus Fire Department at 22. I worked my way up through 37 years of smoke-filled stairwells, burst water mains, and too many kitchens where someone left something on the stove and went to sleep. I made captain in my early 40s. I earned 3 commendations and a set of injuries my orthopedic surgeon liked to call a career in pictures. 3 ribs fractured across different years, 1 lung that still catches on cold mornings from a chemical fire on the east side, and a left knee that predicts rain better than any forecast app my granddaughter has ever shown me. I retired 4 years ago with a badge that had gone dark with age, its surface worn smooth in the places my thumb had rubbed across it 10,000 times. It was not worth much in dollars, but it represented a promise I had made at 22 and kept every single day until the morning I handed in my gear, never leave anyone behind. My wife Carol passed away 7 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the way that disease tends to be. Our son Ethan was 32 when we lost her, old enough to handle it on paper, young enough that I could see the ground shift under him in ways he never fully recovered from. I threw myself into being present for him. In the years that followed, attended every dinner he invited me to, drove 2 hours to watch him give a presentation at a regional conference, because I heard in his voice that he wanted someone there. That was what fatherhood looked like to me. I paid for his graduate degree. When he found a house in Dublin, a quiet suburb north of Columbus, I co-signed the mortgage because his credit was still thin. And when he came to me 6 years ago with the idea of starting his own fire safety inspection company, I did not hesitate. "I want to do what you did, Dad," he told me over dinner, leaning forward the way he used to as a teenager when he was excited about something. Not the running into fires part, the preventing them, making sure people are safe before anything goes wrong. I felt something open in my chest when he said that. I wrote him a check for $80,000, my entire liquid savings outside of retirement, and gave him permission to use my name. I also gave him copies of my professional documentation to use in the company's promotional materials. My full personnel file, the department seal image, signed, sample letters. He was my son. I trusted him completely. Bennett Fire Safety opened its doors 4 years ago. In the beginning, it was exactly what Ethan had described, a small, serious operation. The name carried weight in Columbus because I had spent nearly 4 decades building it. What I did not know, what I chose not to look too closely at, was that the company's finances had begun sliding badly in its 2nd year. Ethan had always been optimistic in ways that occasionally outpaced reality. He took on contracts that stretched the company's capacity and signed agreements that bled money quietly. And then there was Vanessa. Ethan had married her the year before the company launched. She was sharp and polished in a way that filled rooms. Under her direction, Bennett Fire Safety acquired a gleaming new logo and a social media presence that made it look considerably more established than it was. I want to be honest with myself here. I knew something was off in the months before that October evening. Ethan had stopped mentioning revenue figures. He changed the subject with a smoothness I recognized in retrospect as practiced. But I told myself he was an adult with the right to manage his own business, and that asking too many questions would feel like doubt. That was my mistake. There is one more person I need to tell you about before we get to that October evening. Jimmy Reyes was 28 years old when I retired fresh out of his probationary period and assigned to Station 12 on the South Side. He had come to the department after 2 years in the Army, and he carried himself with the uprightness of someone who had decided exactly what kind of person he wanted to be. He asked better questions than anyone I had trained in my final decade. I thought about Jimmy a great deal after I retired. I had no way of knowing then that he had less than a year left to live, or that the building that would take his life had already been half built across town, its walls packed with materials that should never have been permitted inside a structure where people slept. But that story begins on a Tuesday evening in October, when my son knocked on my front door with his wife, and a folder thick enough to change everything. The folder landed on my coffee table with a sound that I still hear sometimes late at night when the house is too quiet. A dense, deliberate thud, the kind that does not ask permission before it changes the shape of a room. Ethan had set it down, but Vanessa had chosen the moment. I had known Vanessa for 4 years by then, long enough to understand that very little she did was accidental. She was the kind of woman who arrived somewhere, and immediately, without appearing to try, became the center of its gravity. She was dressed that evening in a dark blazer over a fitted blouse, her hair pulled back cleanly, a slim leather portfolio tucked under one arm, as though she had come straight from a board meeting. She sat across from me on my old sofa, with her hands folded in her lap, and her posture absolutely perfect, and she smiled at me, the way you smile at someone when you have already decided how the conversation is going to end. Ethan sat beside her. He was wearing the navy pullover I had given him 2 Christmases ago, and he was rubbing the back of his neck with one hand, a habit he had picked up as a child, whenever he was nervous about something, and hoping I would not notice. I noticed. I had always noticed. We wanted to bring this to you in person. Ethan began leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. There's an opportunity, Dad, a real one, the kind that doesn't come around twice. He slid the folder toward me across the coffee table. I picked it up and opened it. The project was called Halpern Heights, a 22-story mixed-use residential tower being developed by Halpern Development Group, a mid-sized construction firm with a dozen projects across central Ohio. The building was 80% complete. The developer was pressing toward a ribbon-cutting ceremony within 60 days. The contract being offered to Bennett Fire Safety was for final safety certification signing off, that the building's fire suppression and life safety systems met code requirements under NFPA 11 and Ohio's residential high-rise standards. The contract value was listed near the back of the folder, $4.8 million. I turned pages slowly. I had spent 37 years reading buildings the way other people read faces, and something in the documents made my chest tighten before I had fully articulated why. I kept reading. I reached the system inspection summaries, the records showing which components had been independently tested, which had passed, and which were still pending. Where's the independent lab report on the exterior cladding material? I asked, setting a page down. Vanessa's expression did not change. The developer is working with a certified materials supplier. The documentation is in process. In process, I repeated, meaning it doesn't exist yet, meaning it will be finalized before occupancy. She said, her voice smooth, and even the way a polished floor is smooth, beautiful until you slip on it. I turned to the sprinkler system summary. Floors 1 through 13 showed full installation and pressure testing. Floors 14 through 18 showed installation, complete pressure testing, listed as pending contractor review. I closed the folder. The suppression system on the upper 4 floors hasn't been tested, I said. I looked at Ethan, not Vanessa, because I needed to see his face when I said it. Ethan, that's not a paperwork delay. That's a life safety gap. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands pressed together between his knees, his knuckles going pale. The contractor has committed to completing the testing within 2 weeks of our certification. It's a formality at this point, Dad. The system is installed and functional. If it hasn't been tested under load, you don't know that it's functional. You know that it's installed. I set the folder on the table between us. These are 2 different things. Vanessa uncrossed her legs and leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding mine with a steadiness that most people would have mistaken for confidence. I recognized it as something closer to calculation. Arthur, she said, her tone shifting into something softer and more deliberate. I want you to understand the full picture here. Bennett Fire Safety is carrying $2.9 million in outstanding debt across 3 lines of credit. The company has 61 employees. The Halpern contract would not only clear that debt, it would fund 18 months of operations and put the company on genuinely solid footing for the first time. She paused. 61 people, Arthur, with families, mortgages, children in school. The words landed exactly where she had aimed them, and I felt the weight of them, because I am not made of stone, and she knew it. But I had also spent decades learning the difference between pressure that was legitimate and pressure that was designed to make you stop thinking clearly. How many people are going to live in that building? I asked. Vanessa blinked. It was the first unguarded thing she had done since she walked through my door. The project lists 340 residential units, I continued. That's potentially 800, 900 people, Vanessa. Families, children in school. I stood up from my armchair because I needed to be standing for what I was about to say. I will not sign a certification for a building with untested suppression systems and unverified exterior materials. That is not a negotiating position. It is not a starting point. It is the end of this conversation. Ethan shot to his feet. His voice cracked at the edges in a way that broke something in me, even as I held my ground. Dad, if this falls through, we lose the company. We lose everything. We lose the house. His eyes were glassy and urgent, the eyes of a man who had been drowning slowly for months and had just felt the current pull. I came to you because you're the only person I trust with this. Please. My heart ached for him with a ferocity that I will not try to minimize. This was my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike in the parking lot of Station 4 on a Sunday morning when I had a shift in 4 hours and I did not care. The teenager who had sat on the hospital floor outside his mother's room and cried into my shoulder until we were both exhausted. I wanted more than almost anything in that moment to find a way to say yes, but the answer was no. It had been no from the moment I read the suppression system summary, and no amount of love was going to change what the document said. I'm sorry, I told him, and I meant it with everything I had. I cannot put my name on something that could get people killed. You know why. You have always known why. Ethan turned away from me, pressing the heel of his hand against his forehead. Vanessa rose from the sofa in a single fluid motion. She straightened her blazer, picked up her portfolio, and then paused in front of the glass cabinet near my front hallway, the one where I kept the badge from my retirement mounted inside on a small piece of dark velvet. She looked at it for a long moment, her head tilted slightly the way you look at something you are already thinking about differently than its owner does. It's interesting, she said quietly, almost to herself, though she knew I could hear every word. A reputation like yours is a remarkable thing, Arthur. The whole city knows your name. The whole city trusts it. She turned to look at me over her shoulder, and her eyes were flat and precise and absolutely certain. It's interesting how a story told the right way at the right time can completely reframe what people think they know about a person. She walked out without another word. Ethan followed her without looking at me. I stood alone in my hallway, the front door closed the room, carrying the particular silence of something that has just shifted in a direction you cannot take back. I looked at the badge behind the glass. I had never once thought of it as something that could be used against me. I thought it was anger talking when she said what she said, the frustration of a woman who had not gotten what she came for. 3 weeks later, I understood it had been an instruction. The phone buzzed on my nightstand at 2:17 in the morning. I was not fully asleep. I had not been fully asleep in 3 weeks, not since the evening Vanessa walked out of my house with that measured smile and those flat, certain eyes. I had been lying in the dark most nights running the same calculations over and over, the sprinkler gaps, the untested cladding, the $4.8 million that my refusal had taken off the table, and trying to convince myself that I had done the right thing and that the discomfort I felt was simply the price of integrity. The buzz was a message from Dennis Carver, my old partner from Station 12, a man I had worked beside for 16 years before he transferred to the arson investigation unit. There were no words in the message, just a photograph. I held the phone above my face in the dark and looked at it, and my chest seized so hard I had to sit up to breathe. The sky above the south side of Columbus was the color of a wound. Halpern Heights was burning. I dressed in 40 seconds, an old habit, the kind your hands remember without consulting your brain, and I was in my truck and moving before I had fully processed what I was driving toward. The radio picked up the dispatch frequency, and I listened to the calls stacking up, units being redirected, the controlled urgency of voices that were working very hard not to sound like what they were feeling. I had spent 37 years on that frequency. I knew what controlled urgency sounded like when it was holding something worse underneath. I parked 4 blocks out and walked the rest of the way because the street was already sealed. The night air tasted of smoke, and something chemical underneath it, a bitter synthetic edge that told me before I saw anything else that the exterior cladding was involved. That particular smell was something you learned to recognize and never forgot. It meant the fire was not contained to the interior. It meant the building itself was burning. The scene that met me at the perimeter stopped me where I stood. Halpern Heights was 22 stories of glass and steel, and as I now understood, whatever cost-cutting material the developer had packed behind its exterior panels. The fire had started according to the radio traffic in a residential unit on the 16th floor. But it had not stayed there. It had found the cladding, and the cladding had taken it, and now the upper third of the building was lit from within like something terrible and a live flame venting from windows on multiple floors. Simultaneously, the glass already gone on most of them. I gripped the chain link fence in front of me with both hands. My knuckles ached with the force of it, and I did not let go. I could see even from where I stood, even through the smoke, that the sprinkler discharge on the upper floors was wrong. The pattern was incomplete. 3 floors were showing active suppression. The floor above them was not. The floor above that was not. The gap I had seen on paper 3 weeks ago, the testing listed as pending contractor review, was not pending anymore. It was present, and it was visible, and it was costing people everything. The radio crackled. A unit commander called for additional aerial support on the east stairwell. A second voice reported that the fire door on floor 17 had failed to close. Automatically, the mechanism had not functioned. Residents were being redirected to the west stairwell, which meant traffic from 17 floors converging on a single exit path, while the east side of the building continued to vent. I stood at that fence for a long time. I do not know exactly how long. Long enough to watch 3 ladder trucks reposition. Long enough to see the aerial platform extend toward a window on the 18th floor where someone was visible leaning out waving both arms. Long enough to watch the rescue succeed and feel relief for approximately 4 seconds before the radio reported a partial floor collapse on 16. They brought the first stretcher out at 4:21 in the morning. Then the second, then the third and fourth together, carried by 4 firefighters moving quickly with their heads down. And I recognized the posture, not because of the speed, but because of the particular way they were not looking at the crowd. You learned that posture in your first year. It was the posture of carrying something that you needed to deliver and could not afford to feel until later. By the time the sun came up, gray and thin over the Columbus skyline, the incident commander had called a recovery operation on 2 floors. 11 people had not made it out. 2 of them were children. One of them was a firefighter who had entered the building on the initial response and had not come back out when the floor gave. I knew before they confirmed it over the radio. I think I had known since I saw the ladder company from Station 12 pulling equipment from their rig in the early hours, because Jimmy Reyes always worked the overnight shift rotation, and Station 12 had been one of the first units on scene. The confirmation came at 6:48. I pressed my forehead against the chain link fence and closed my eyes, and the metal was cold against my skin, and I was glad for it because it was real and solid, and I needed something real and solid to hold on to. My throat locked completely. My eyes burned so badly I could not have opened them if I tried, and I did not try because I was not ready to see the world again yet. I stood there with my head against that fence, and I thought about a young man sitting in an apparatus bay with a code book in his hands, asking why the standards allowed a 30-second delay, writing the answer down in a small notebook because he wanted to understand, because he cared about getting it right. He had cared more than the people who built that building. He had cared more than the people who approved it. He had cared more in the end than almost anyone involved, and it had not been enough to save him. I heard footsteps on the pavement behind me, and I straightened up because I would not be seen that way by anyone, not because of pride, but because I needed to function, and I could not do that, folded over a fence. I turned around. Ethan was standing 20 feet away. His coat collar turned up against the cold, his face the color of old chalk. Vanessa stood just behind his right shoulder, her eyes moving across the building and back to me, with an expression I could not read, not grief, not guilt, something more controlled than either. Something watchful. Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and I looked back at him, and I watched something move through his face that I had no name for, something that was not quite shame and not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. His mouth opened slightly. Then he turned away. He turned away from me and walked back toward the street, and Vanessa followed without a word, and I stood alone at the perimeter, with the smoke still rising above the south side of the city, and 11 people gone, and the particular silence of a man who had been right about something, and wished with everything he had that he had been wrong. 2 days later, they knocked on my door at 6 in the morning. That was when I learned that being right had never been the point. They knocked at 6 in the morning, 2 days after the fire. Not the polite knock of a neighbor, or the hesitant tap of someone unsure of their welcome. This was the knock of people who had already decided they were coming, in regardless 3 sharp raps that rattled the storm door in its frame and sent a jolt through my chest that had nothing to do with surprise. I had been awake for an hour already, sitting at my kitchen table, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at nothing in particular and thinking about Jimmy Reyes. I opened the door. 2 people stood on my porch. The one in front was a woman in her mid-40s, dark coat, her badge clipped to her belt where I could see it clearly. Detective Sandra Mora, Columbus Police Department. Behind her stood a uniformed officer, younger, hands loose at his sides, whose nameplate read Hicks. Detective Mora held a folded document in her right hand, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times and found it unremarkable. "Arthur Bennett," she said. "That's me." She held out the document. "We have a search warrant for this residence. We're looking for electronic devices, physical files, and any professional correspondence related to your work as a fire safety consultant. I'd ask you to step back inside, please." I took the warrant and read it on the spot, because 37 years of professional life had taught me that you never let urgency override your right to understand what is being done to you. The warrant was signed by a Columbus Municipal Court judge, cited probable cause related to an ongoing investigation into the Halpern Heights fire, and listed specific categories of items to be seized. It was legitimate. I stepped back inside. They were thorough and they were fast. Detective Mora directed the search personally, while Officer Hicks worked through the back rooms. They took my laptop from the desk in the spare bedroom. They took the filing cabinet that held my old inspection records from the department, 3 drawers of documentation, going back 20 years, that I had kept out of habit, and a vague sense that a career deserved a paper record. They took my phone off the kitchen counter, and they took the metal lockbox from the shelf in my closet, the one that held my retirement documents, my department commendations, and a folder of miscellaneous professional records from my last years as captain. I watched Officer Hicks carry it out and felt something cold move through me, though I could not have said exactly why. Not yet. Detective Mora asked me to sit at the kitchen table. She sat across from me and set a manila folder between us, and she opened it with the careful movements of someone who understood that what was inside was going to matter. She was not unkind. She was not aggressive. She was precise, which in some ways was harder to manage than either. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I'm going to show you several items and ask you to respond to each one. You have the right to have an attorney present. Do you want to wait for counsel before we proceed?" "Show me what you have," I said. She placed the first document on the table in front of me. It was a safety certification letter for Halpern Heights dated 3 weeks before the fire. It was printed on what appeared to be Bennett Fire Safety letterhead. It stated in the formal language of professional certification that the building's fire suppression and life safety systems had been inspected and found to be in compliance with NFPA 101 and applicable Ohio high-rise residential standards. At the bottom of the page was my signature, my full name written in my handwriting, or something so close to my handwriting that my stomach dropped when I looked at it. Below the signature, my personnel number from the Columbus Fire Department, which I had used as a professional identifier for decades, and the official seal of the department, which should not have existed on a private consultant's document at all. "That is not my signature," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me. Detective Mora nodded slowly as though she had expected me to say exactly that. She placed the second document beside the first. It was a printout of an email sent from my personal email address to Ethan's business account, time-stamped 11 days before the fire. The subject line read, "Halpern Final Notes." The body of the email read, "Ethan went back through the system documentation. There are a few areas that are still pending, but nothing that rises to the level of delaying the certification timeline. I'm comfortable with the current state of completion. Let's proceed." My hands pressed flat against the tabletop. I could feel the wood grain under my palms, and I focused on that, the specific physical reality of it. because I needed something solid while the floor tried to drop out from under me. I did not write that email, I said. I have never sent anything to that address in the past 4 months. My son and I have not been in professional contact since October. Detective Mora did not argue with me. She simply placed the third item on the table. It was a still image printed from what appeared to be security camera footage. The timestamp in the corner read 11:43 p.m., approximately 10 days before the fire. The location tag read Bennett Fire, Safety Main Office, Dublin, OH. The image showed a man entering through the front door of my son's office building after hours. He was wearing a dark jacket, a jacket that looked with a precision that made my jaw tighten, exactly like the one hanging in my front closet. He carried a cane in his right hand, the aluminum kind with the rubber grip that I had started using 18 months ago when my left knee stopped cooperating on cold mornings. The camera angle caught him from behind and slightly above. His face was not visible, but his height, his build. The particular way he carried his right shoulder slightly higher than his left, an old compensation habit from the years I had carried a heavy gear on that side, were all present and exact. I stared at that photograph for a long time. My heart was hammering so hard, I was certain Detective Mora could hear it across the table. My mind was running backward through everything I knew and everything I had given access to over the years, and landing with a sickening clarity on the same answer every single time. Ethan had my signature. He had copies of my professional documents from the years he had asked to use them for the company's promotional materials. He had photographs of the department seal. He had borrowed that jacket for a charity golf event 3 years ago and returned it without incident, which meant he knew exactly where I kept it. He had a key to my house. He had watched me walk with that cane for a year and a half. He had everything he needed. He had always had everything he needed. These have been fabricated, I said. My voice was quieter now, not from uncertainty, but from the particular stillness that comes when you understand something terrible completely. Every one of them. I know who had access to the materials needed to create these documents, and I will tell you everything I know. But I need you to understand, I refused to sign anything for that project. I refused in person in front of witnesses 3 weeks before that fire started. Detective Mora closed the folder. She looked at me with an expression that was professionally neutral and underneath that genuinely unreadable. Mr. Bennett, she said carefully, under Ohio Revised Code, you are being formally notified that you are the subject of a criminal investigation. The charges under consideration include falsification of safety records under ORC 29-1T.42, obstruction of justice under ORC 2921.32, and criminally negligent homicide under ORC 2903.05, the latter carrying a potential sentence of up to 18 months per count, with 11 counts applicable. 11 counts. One for each person who had not come home. I sat with that number in the kitchen where I had eaten breakfast alone every morning for 11 years, and I felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold and very determined all at once. Not despair, not panic. Something older than either of those things. Something that had been built across a career spent walking toward what other people ran from. They were going to try to make me the reason 11 people died. I was going to make sure they could not. I'd like to call my attorney now, I said. By noon that same day, my face was on television. Not the way it had been once or twice over the years. A brief clip at a department ceremony. A background shot at a press conference after a major incident. This was different. This was my retirement photo pulled from the department's public archive, filling the upper right corner of the screen, while a news anchor read from a prepared statement in the measured, grave tone that local news reserves for stories it expects to run for several days. I sat on my living room couch and watched it with the sound on, because I needed to know exactly what was being said about me. The anchor called me a disgraced former fire captain. She said I was the subject of a criminal investigation in connection with the Halpern Heights fire. She said that sources close to the investigation had indicated that a safety certification bearing my signature and credentials had been found among the project's approval documents, and that questions had been raised about my mental and professional fitness in the months leading up to the disaster. Then the broadcast cut to Ethan. He was standing outside somewhere I did not immediately recognize, wearing a dark coat with his hands clasped in front of him. His eyes were red at the rims. His voice when he spoke was quiet and controlled and devastatingly convincing. My father is a man I have loved and respected my entire life. He said, looking directly into the camera with an expression of such practiced sorrow that my stomach turned over. But over the past year, I've watched him struggle in ways that frighten me, forgetting appointments, making decisions that didn't reflect the man I grew up with. I tried to talk to him about getting help. He refused. He paused, pressing his lips together, as though steadying himself. I don't know exactly what happened with the Halpern project. What I know is that my father has not been himself, and I blame myself for not doing more to intervene sooner. Then Vanessa appeared beside him, her hand finding his arm, her eyes glistening with tears that caught the light at exactly the right angle. Arthur has struggled with the transition to retirement more than anyone realized, she said softly. He wanted so much to still be relevant, to still matter. We should have gotten him professional support a long time ago. This is a tragedy for everyone involved, and our hearts break for the families who lost someone. The broadcast cut back to the anchor, who mentioned that sources had also described incidents of Arthur Bennett leaving a gas burner on, overnight getting lost while driving in his own neighborhood, and confusing family members' names on multiple occasions. Every word of it was a lie, precise, plausible, and completely false. I turned off the television because I could not watch any more of it without doing something I would regret, and I sat in the quiet of my living room with my hands on my knees and my jaw so tight it ached. My chest was burning with a fury that had nowhere to go. Not at the television, not at the walls, not at the empty house around me. I had spent 37 years controlling my responses under extreme pressure. I called on every year of that training, now breathing slowly and deliberately, letting the anger move through me without letting it make any decisions. The first rock hit my front window at 2 in the afternoon. It did not break the glass, it was a small stone thrown from the street, but the crack of it against the pane brought me to my feet in an instant. I looked out through the curtain and saw a man I did not recognize standing at the edge of my front lawn, his face red and contorted, pointing at my house with one hand. My nephew died in that building. He shouted loud enough that I could hear him through the glass. My nephew was 24 years old. You signed off on that death trap, you hear me. You signed your name and people died. I did not go outside. There was nothing I could say to that man that would help either of us, and I understood somewhere beneath the fury and the grief that he was not entirely wrong to be standing there, just wrong about who had put him there. By 4 o'clock, someone had thrown red paint across my front door. I discovered it when I opened the door to bring in my mail and found the letters dripping down the wood in long streaks, the color of something I had seen too many times, in too many real contexts, to find it anything but exhausting. The phone calls started that evening and did not stop. I unplugged the landline at 7. At 8:15, I received a voicemail from Roy Callahan. Roy had been a lieutenant at Station 8 when I was a captain, a solid firefighter and a decent man who had moved up through the department after my retirement and was now chief. We had always maintained a respectful relationship, the kind built on shared years and mutual understanding rather than genuine closeness. His voice on the voicemail was strained in a way I had never heard from him before. "Arthur, it's Roy. I need you to know that I don't believe what they're saying. I want that on the record between us." He stopped and I could hear him choosing his next words carefully. "But the city manager's office has been in contact with the department. Given the active investigation and the public response, they've asked us to temporarily remove your name from the recognition board in the main hall. I've been told this is a formality pending resolution of the investigation." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm sorry. I genuinely am. I'll put it back myself the moment this is over. That's a promise." The recognition board. 37 years of service reduced to a formality. I sat down on the bottom step of my staircase and pressed my hands against my face, and I breathed through them until the tightness in my chest loosened enough that I could think clearly again. My eyes were burning, and I let them burn because I was alone, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. The 3 attorneys I called that week each told me, in their own way, the same thing. The first said the evidence was too damaging and the public atmosphere too volatile for a successful defense. The second offered to negotiate a plea arrangement that would reduce my exposure significantly if I cooperated. The third sat across from me in his office and said very gently that sometimes accepting a difficult outcome was the wisest form of self-preservation. I showed all 3 of them to the door. It was a Thursday evening 9 days after the fire when I heard the knock at my back door. Softer than Detective Mora's knock, tentative in a way that suggested the person on the other side was genuinely uncertain of their welcome. I opened it to find Patricia Mills standing on my back step, holding a ceramic dish covered in foil with both hands. She was my neighbor of 14 years, a retired school administrator who had lost her husband to a stroke 4 years ago, and had since developed the particular self-sufficiency of someone who understood that life continued whether or not it was convenient. She was wearing her gardening coat over her house clothes, and her expression was the most straightforward thing I had seen in 9 days. "I made too much soup," she said, holding out the dish. "Chicken and rice. You can tell me you don't want it, and I'll take it back, but I'm guessing you haven't eaten a real meal since all this started." My throat tightened without warning. I had not expected kindness, and the body, it turns out, is considerably less prepared for kindness than for hostility when it has been braced for long enough. "Pat," I started, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. "You don't have to say anything," she said firmly, pushing the dish gently toward me until I took it. "I've lived next door to you for 14 years, Arthur Bennett. I know who you are, not who the television says you are, who you actually are." She held my gaze with the steady certainty of a woman who had made up her mind about something a long time ago and had not changed it. "Eat the soup, get some sleep, and don't you dare give up." She turned and walked back across the yard. Before I could respond, her coat disappearing into the dark between our houses. I stood at my back door holding a ceramic dish of chicken and rice, and for the first time in 9 days, something in my chest that had been locked completely tight shifted just slightly towards something that was not quite hope, but was in the same direction. The next morning, Daniel Mercer knocked on my front door with 2 cups of coffee, and the only question that was going to matter. Daniel Mercer had been waking up at 5:30 every morning for 40 years, and retirement had not changed that. When he knocked on my front door at 6:45, he had already been awake for over an hour, which meant he had spent that hour thinking before he came, and Daniel never spent an hour thinking without arriving somewhere specific. He was holding 2 cups from the diner on Broadview Avenue, the one we had been going to, since the early 90s when it was still called Patty's, and the coffee was terrible, and we went anyway because it was open at 5 a.m. and nothing else was. He handed one to me through the door without waiting to be invited in, then stepped past me into the hallway with the ease of a man who had been in this house enough times that asking permission felt like a formality neither of us needed. He was 71 years old and looked at honestly a broad-shouldered man running slightly to weight, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had never been handsome but had always been trustworthy. He had spent 30 years as a fire cause and origin investigator for the Columbus Fire Department, which meant he had spent 30 years walking into the aftermath of disasters and working backward from the evidence to the truth. He was the best I had ever seen at it. He thought the way fire moved systematically following the path of least resistance until it found something worth consuming. He looked at the red paint on my front door on his way in and did not comment on it. That was Daniel. He filed it and moved on. We sat at my kitchen table. He took the small spiral notebook from his shirt pocket, the same brand he had been using for 3 decades, narrow-ruled, the cover always slightly bent from being carried close to the body, and he set it on the table beside his coffee cup. He looked at me with steady gray eyes that had seen too many burned rooms to be easily disturbed by anything. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. Don't summarize. I'll tell you what matters." So I did. I told him about the October evening, the folder on the coffee table, Vanessa's presentation, Ethan's desperation. I told him about the sprinkler gaps and the unverified cladding and the $4.8 million and my refusal. I told him about Vanessa's comment at the door and the 3 weeks of quiet afterward and the photograph that arrived on my phone at 2:17 in the morning. I told him about standing at the perimeter fence and watching the stretchers come out and knowing before the radio confirmed it which one was Jimmy. I told him about the search warrant and the 3 pieces of evidence Detective Mora had placed on my kitchen table one after another, like cards in a hand that had already been dealt. Daniel listened without interrupting. He wrote in his notebook occasionally, not constantly, just when something landed. His coffee sat mostly untouched. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, not from uncertainty, but from the particular focused stillness of a man organizing what he had just heard into something he could work with. Then he asked his question. "Who had access to your signature, your department personnel number, your professional seal, and your coat?" The answer hit me the way answers do when you already know them and have been avoiding looking directly at them. Not like a revelation, but like a confirmation of something that had been sitting at the edge of your vision for days. "Ethan," I said, My voice came out flat and certain the way it did when I was reporting facts at a scene rather than processing feelings about them. 6 years ago, when we were setting up the company, he asked me for copies of my professional documentation to use in the promotional materials. His exact words were that clients would respond to seeing my credentials associated with the Bennett name. I gave him everything: my full personnel file, copies of the department seal image signed sample letters. I pressed my palm against the table. He borrowed the coat for a charity golf fundraiser 3 years ago. He has a key to this house. He has watched me use that cane for a year and a half. Daniel wrote something down. He did not look shocked. He did not look sympathetic. He looked like a man who had just confirmed the origin point of a fire and was already thinking about where it had spread. "The email," he said, "sent from your personal account. I have not emailed Ethan about anything professional in 4 months. We had a falling out in October. My account password hasn't changed in 2 years. I stopped. The implication settled into the room like smoke. He knows my password. I gave it to him 2 years ago when my laptop was in for repairs and he was handling some correspondence for me. Daniel nodded, once wrote 2 more words and closed the notebook. "Yeah, all right," he said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup and finally taking a drink. "Here is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to the Halpern site. Not officially, I don't have that authority anymore, but the perimeter isn't sealed on the north side, and I still know people on the investigation team who will answer a question if I ask it the right way." He looked at me steadily. "The cause and origin report hasn't been finalized yet. That means there are still things at that site that haven't been fully documented. I want to look at the suppression system failure pattern and the exterior material burn rate before someone decides what the official narrative is going to be." "Daniel," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, carrying more weight than I had meant to put into a single word. He held up one hand. "Don't thank me yet. I haven't found anything." He pulled the notebook back out of his pocket and opened it to a fresh page. "I need you to write down every professional document you gave Ethan. Every copy, every scan, every original. Date if you remember, it approximate if you don't. I need the name of every person who was present when you gave him access to this house." He tapped the page with his pen. "And I need you to think very carefully about anyone else, anyone at all, who might have had access to your email account or your signing credentials in the past 3 years. I took the notebook and the pen he held out and began writing. My hand was steady. That surprised me a little after 9 days of feeling like the ground had turned to water under my feet. The act of writing specific facts in a specific list felt like catching hold of something solid, something I could use. We worked through the morning. Daniel asked questions in the precise, unhurried way of someone who understood that the details other people considered irrelevant were frequently the ones that mattered most. He asked about the golf event where Ethan had borrowed the coat, who else was there, who had taken photographs, whether the coat had been returned the same day. He asked about the camera angles in Ethan's office building. Had I ever been inside after hours? Was there any legitimate footage of me entering that building that could be distinguished from the fabricated clip? At 11:30, he stood up, tucked the notebook back into his pocket, and picked up his empty cup. 3 days, he said, moving toward the front door. "Give me 3 days at the site and one conversation with someone I trust on the investigation team. Don't talk to the media. Don't talk to anyone from the department. Don't call Ethan." He paused with his hand on the door and looked back at me with an expression that was not quite reassurance. Daniel did not traffic in reassurance, but was something adjacent to it. Something that said he had walked into worse situations than this and come out with the truth. "And Arthur," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "whatever I find, I need you to be ready for it to be worse than what you already know." I met his eyes. "I've been a firefighter for 37 years, Daniel. I don't look away from what's in the room." He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once and walked out into the November morning. I stood in my hallway after the door closed, my hand resting on the wall beside it, and for the first time since 2:17 a.m., 11 days ago, I felt something that was not despair or fury or the grinding exhaustion of a man fighting alone. It was not hope exactly. It was something more useful than hope. It was a plan. 3 days later, Daniel called me from the ruins of Halpern Heights, and what he said changed everything. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after Daniel left, while I was looking for something else entirely. Daniel had asked me to pull together every piece of professional documentation I had given Ethan over the years, copies of certifications signed, sample letters, anything bearing my credentials. Most of it was in the filing cabinet the police had already taken, but I remembered keeping duplicates of the oldest materials in the spare bedroom closet in a cardboard box that had not been opened since the year I retired. I had gone looking for that box. The spare bedroom had been Ethan's room from the time he was 12 until he left for college. I had never fully converted it. There was still a bookshelf along the east wall that held a mix of things, half of them mine and half of them objects Ethan had left behind in various moves over the years and never collected. Old textbooks, a broken desk lamp I kept meaning to throw away, a framed photograph of the three of us, Ethan, Carol, and me at his high school graduation. Carol laughing at something off camera, with her whole face the way she always laughed. Ethan looking at the lens with that particular expression teenagers wear when they are trying not to look happy and failing. I stood in front of that photograph for longer than I intended. Then I turned to the bookshelf and started going through the titles. The book was on the third shelf, wedged between an old building code reference manual and a copy of a fire investigation textbook I had used in a training course decades ago. It was a slim volume on fire safety standards that I had given Ethan in the first year of the company, a gesture more than a practical gift, a way of saying that I was behind him and wanted him to build something real. The cover was dark blue and the spine was barely creased. He had not read it much. I pulled it off the shelf because it was one of the books I had inscribed. I had written something in the front cover, and I thought the inscription might reference my credentials in a way that would be useful to document for Daniel. I opened it to the front page. My inscription was there, 4 lines in my handwriting, the date, and a short note wishing him well with the company. And between the front cover and the first page, there was a small piece of paper folded once. I unfolded it with 2 fingers, carefully the way you handle something at a scene that you are not sure about yet. The handwriting was Ethan's. I had known his handwriting since he was 7 years old, the particular way he formed his lowercase letters, the slight leftward lean that his 3rd grade teacher had tried to correct and never fully succeeded. There was no mistaking it. 7 words. Dad, check the badge number. I'm sorry, my son had known. He had known because Vanessa had told him exactly who she hired. Mark Delaney, a terminated firefighter who had worked Station 9, a man whose department badge number Ethan would have seen on the paperwork Vanessa put in front of him. Ethan had sat in that room and looked at the number and understood what it meant, and he had not been able to say it out loud to anyone who could stop it. So he had written it down in the only place he thought was safe and left it for me to find and hoped I would know what to do with it when he no longer could. I stood in the middle of my son's old bedroom, holding a piece of paper the size of a grocery receipt, and the floor did not drop out from under me the way it might have. Instead, something happened that was in some ways worse. Everything went very still. My breathing slowed. The room around me came into sharp focus in the particular way that extreme moments sometimes produce, where you are aware of every detail. Simultaneously, the dust on the bookshelf, the afternoon light coming through the curtain, at an angle the weight of the paper between my fingers, the sound of a car passing on the street outside. My son had known. He had known what Vanessa was planning. He had known she intended to use my badge, my credentials, my name. He had known, and he had not called me. He had not come to me. He had not gone to the police or the fire department or anyone with the authority to stop what was coming. He had taken a small piece of paper and written 7 words on it and hidden it in a book on a shelf in a room he had not lived in for over a decade, in a house he visited 3 or 4 times a year, and he had left it there like a confession dropped into the ocean. Why not call? The answer came to me slowly, and it landed with a weight that made my chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the old lung damage. Vanessa monitored his phone. She read his messages he had mentioned it once 2 years ago in passing, in the careful way people mention things they have normalized that they should not have normalized. She checked his call logs. She went through his email on his laptop when she thought he was asleep. He had laughed about it slightly when he mentioned it, the nervous laugh of someone performing casualness about something that was not casual at all. The book was the only thing she could not monitor, a shelf in a room in his father's house that she had no reason to search. He had been trying to tell me, in the only way he believed was safe, in the only way that could not be traced or intercepted, he had left me a 7-word note in a book I might never have opened. I sat down on the edge of the old bed, the mattress still firm, the navy comforter still folded at the foot, the way I had always kept it, and I looked at the note in my hands and I felt something move through me that I am still not sure I have a proper name for. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was something older and more complicated than either of those. Something that lived in the territory between grief and fury and the particular ache of loving someone who has shown you beyond any possible doubt the exact shape and dimension of their weakness. My son had known, and he had not been strong enough to do more than this. 11 people were dead. Jimmy Reyes was dead. And my son had known, and the best he had managed was 7 words in a book. I sat on that bed for a long time. My eyes were burning, and my throat was locked tight, and I pressed my lips together hard because I needed to hold myself in one piece right now, needed to stay functional, needed to think rather than feel. And every time I looked at the note, the feeling tried to claw its way past the thinking, and I would not let it, not yet, not until I had done what needed to be done with what I was holding. Finally, I folded the note back along its crease. I stood up. I put the book back on the shelf, then took it back down again, and put it under my arm to take with me, because it was evidence, and I had learned a long time ago not to leave evidence where it had been found. I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, the background noise telling me he was still somewhere near the Halpern site. I found something, I said. Come to the house when you're done. How bad? He asked, straight to it the way Daniel always was. I looked down at the folded piece of paper in my hand at my son's handwriting, at 7 words that had come too late to save anyone and might yet be enough to save me. It's not bad, I said. It's a starting point. When Daniel arrived that evening, he read the note twice, set it on the kitchen table, and looked at it for a moment with the expression he wore when he was reading a fire pattern, not reacting, just absorbing. Then he reached into his pocket and took out his notebook. Badge number 4197, he said, writing it down. Let's find out what 4172 belongs to. Daniel called me 4 days after he left with the notebook. I was in the kitchen when the phone rang, standing at the counter eating toast. I did not taste because I had not been tasting food for 2 weeks, my mind running the same loops it had been running since the morning Detective Mora laid those 3 documents on my table. I picked up on the first ring. I'm at the site, Daniel said. No greeting, no preamble that was Daniel when he had found something. You need to hear this in order, so don't interrupt me. Go ahead. He had spent 4 days at the Halpern Heights perimeter, working the way he had always worked methodically early in the mornings, when the official investigation teams were doing paperwork and the site was quieter. He still knew the fire marshal's deputy, a man named Garrett, who had trained under Daniel 20 years ago, and who understood, without being asked directly, that Daniel Mercer did not make social calls to active investigation sites. What Daniel had found was not one thing. It was a pattern, and patterns were what he had spent 30 years learning to read. The exterior cladding material, that was the first piece. The official preliminary report had attributed the fire's rapid spread to accelerated combustion of exterior panel materials, which was the bureaucratic way of saying the building's outside walls had burned like kindling. Daniel had obtained a fragment of the cladding through a contact at the debris removal contractor, a small piece legally obtained nothing that would compromise the chain of evidence, and had it tested at a private materials lab he had used during his working years. As the cladding has a flame spread index of over 200, Daniel told me. His voice was steady and factual, the voice he used when he was delivering findings he wanted on record. NFPA 101 requires exterior materials on high-rise residential buildings to have a flame spread index of 25 or below. The material used at Halpern Heights was not close to compliant. It was not a borderline case. It was a material that should never have been permitted inside the walls of a building where people slept. I gripped the edge of the counter. The approval documents listed compliant materials. Yes, Daniel said. They did, which means someone filed false material specifications with the city building department. That is a separate crime from anything involving your signature, and it points directly at the developer and the general contractor. He paused. But that's not the part that changes everything. The suppression system. The van control. Daniel had spent 2 days working backward through the mechanical failure on floors 14 through 18. The sprinkler heads themselves were functional. His contact had confirmed this. The installation was complete. If the system had been pressurized and operational, it would have discharged on those floors, and the fire's vertical spread would have been significantly slowed. The reason it had not discharged was not a mechanical failure. It was a manual intervention. The main control valve for the upper zone suppression system is located in the mechanical room on the 14th floor, Daniel said. It's a large red valve, you've seen 100 of them. Standard installation. The valve was found in the closed position after the fire, which the preliminary report attributed to possible mechanical malfunction. He stopped. It was not a mechanical malfunction. The valve handle had been manually rotated to the closed position. There were tool marks on the housing consistent with the use of a pipe wrench. Someone physically closed that valve. My toast was sitting on the counter, and I had completely forgotten it existed. The camera footage, gone from the main server, deleted between 48 and 72 hours before the fire. He let that land. But the building's security system used a third-party monitoring service, a company called Sentinel Systems out of Westerville. Their servers maintain a 48-hour rolling backup of all camera feeds as part of their standard contract. The backup captured the footage that was deleted from the main system. I was not breathing properly. I made myself slow down. And a man in a building maintenance uniform entered the mechanical room on floor 14 at 8:47 p.m., approximately 4 hours before the fire started. He was in the room for 11 minutes. He exited. The suppression system on floors 14 through 18 did not activate during the fire. Daniel's voice did not change and register, but something in it became more deliberate. I pulled the still image from the backup footage and ran it through a contact at the department who still has access to the personnel database. "The badge number," I said. "As Chief Callahan ran it for me," Daniel said. I called Roy directly. I told him what I had and what I needed, and he ran it through the system without asking questions I could not have answered yet. He paused. "Badge number 4172 was issued to a firefighter named Mark Delaney. Delaney served at Station 9 for 6 years before being terminated for cause specifically the theft of departmental equipment that was later found at a private resale operation. He was dismissed approximately 3 years ago." Mark Delaney, a name I did not recognize, which told me he had come to the department after my time or been assigned to stations I had not worked. A terminated firefighter. A man who knew how department equipment worked, how buildings were laid out, how suppression systems operated, and how to move through a construction site without attracting attention. "He's currently employed as a private security contractor," Daniel continued. "His company has one primary client listed in their business registration, Halpern Development Group." The kitchen was very quiet around me. I could hear the refrigerator running, the sound of a truck somewhere down the block, my own pulse in my ears. My hand on the counter was pressing down hard enough that the knuckles had gone white, and I made myself ease up, made myself breathe, made myself think rather than react. They had not planned a catastrophe. That was the thing I needed to understand, the thing that Daniel said next, and that I had already been working toward on my own. "Here's what I believe happened," Daniel said, and his voice shifted into the register he used when he was presenting a cause and origin conclusion, certain measured built from evidence rather than assumption. Vanessa needed 2 things. She needed the Halpern contract to close so the company could survive, and she needed the building's deficiencies to be obscured before anyone looked too closely. A controlled incident, a minor fire event on 1 or 2 floors would have accomplished both. Insurance pays for the damage, the remediation work covers the substandard materials, and the suppression failure on those floors gets attributed to the incident rather than to the pre-existing deficiency. He stopped. "They planned a small fire, Arthur, a manageable event, a business solution. But they closed the valve on 4 floors, I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended. "Not 1, not 2. They overcorrected," Daniel said. Or Delaney misjudged the zone boundaries, or Vanessa's understanding of suppression system mechanics was not as precise as she believed. He paused again, and this time the pause was heavier. "The cladding is what killed people. Once the fire reached the exterior panels, the behavior changed completely. Nothing they had planned for accounted for that material burning the way it did. 11 people, 2 children, Jimmy Reyes with his notebook and his questions and his 30 years unlived, a business solution." "Daniel," I said, and my voice came out rough and strange, barely recognizable to me. "I need you to tell me we can prove this." "We can prove the valve was manually closed," he said immediately. "We can prove the cladding was non-compliant. We can prove Delaney was in that mechanical room." He took a breath. "What we cannot yet prove is who gave him the instruction. That connection between Delaney and Vanessa, that is what we still need." "The note," I said, "the badge number, is a starting point," Daniel said. "Not a conclusion. We need more." He stopped and I could hear him writing something. I'm going to make one more call tonight. To a woman named Laura Davis. She was listed as a data manager at Bennett Fire Safety on the company's public registration. She was terminated approximately 1 week after the fire. I did not know Laura Davis, but I knew what it meant to be terminated 1 week after a fire that killed 11 people when you had been the person managing the company's data. Call her, I said. I intend to, Daniel said. Get some sleep, Arthur. We're building something here. He hung up, and I stood in my kitchen with the cold toast on the counter and the phone in my hand, and for the first time I felt the shape of what we were constructing, not just a defense but the truth itself, piece by piece, the way you trace a fire backward from its damage to its origin until the cause is undeniable and the record is clear. It was slow work, but I had never been afraid of slow work. The article ran on a Wednesday morning, buried on page 6 of the Columbus Dispatch's Metro section under a headline that read, "Former colleague defends disgraced fire captain." Frank DeLuca had not told me he was going to do it. He had simply done it the way Frank had always operated, deciding something was right, and then doing it without consulting anyone about whether it was wise. I had known Frank for 22 years. We had worked overlapping shifts at Station 4 for nearly a decade before he transferred to the West Side, and in that time, I had watched him argue with 2 different battalion chiefs about safety protocols he believed were inadequate file. A formal complaint against a contractor whose work he considered dangerous, and once physically block a building entrance during a training exercise because he believed the scenario was being run recklessly. He was not a man who calculated the social cost of a position before taking it. He was a man who looked at what was true and said it out loud. He had always been that way. In the early years, some of the older guys on the crew called it recklessness. By the time Frank had 30 years on the job and a record that spoke for itself, they called it integrity. The word fit him the same way a worn coat fits someone who has carried it for decades, easy, natural, and impossible to imagine him without it. The article quoted him directly. "I worked beside Arthur Bennett for over 2 decades, Frank had told the reporter. I have never not once seen that man put his name on something he did not personally verify. The person they're describing on television is not anyone I recognize. Someone is lying, and it is not Arthur." I read those lines 3 times. My throat tightened on the 3rd pass, and I pressed the heel of my hand against my sternum and breathed through it the way I had been breathing through things for 2 weeks, slowly, deliberately, not letting the feeling run the room. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank 20 minutes after I read it. They can say whatever they want about me. I've been retired for 4 years. What are they going to do? Fire me again? Despite everything. Despite the red paint still faintly visible on my front door, despite the unplugged landline, despite the cold weight that had been sitting in my chest since the morning Detective Mora laid those 3 documents on my kitchen table, I felt something loosen slightly when I read that. Not enough to call it relief, enough to call it gratitude. The backlash against Frank was swift and predictable. By afternoon, he had been labeled a co-conspirator on 3 local news comment sections, accused of covering for a dangerous man, and had his retired firefighter status questioned in a post that circulated widely enough to reach people who did not know either of us. I called Frank at 4 o'clock. He picked up on the 2nd ring, his voice carrying the same unhurried ease it always had. "They're calling you an accomplice," I said. "I saw that," he said. "You know what I had for dinner last night, Pasta. You know what I'm having tonight. Also Pasta. Some things don't change. Frank." My voice came out rougher than I intended. "You didn't have to do this. Arthur?" His tone was gentle but firm. "I've been sitting here for 2 weeks watching them put your face on television next to words that have no business being next to it. You want me to sit on my hands because it's complicated. I've been in burning buildings with you. Complicated is not something I'm afraid of." I did not know what to say to that, so I said, "Thank you," and he said, "Don't mention it," and then he told me I should eat something because I sounded like a man who had not been eating. He was not wrong about that either. Frank texted me again at 4:30. "The internet is very upset with me. I made pasta for dinner. Life goes on." I was still holding the phone and almost smiling at that when Daniel called. Someone read Frank's article. He said, skipping any greeting. A reporter at the Dispatch named Carol Stanton. She covers investigations. She contacted me an hour ago. I straightened in my chair. What did she want? She said the timeline of the evidence bothers her. Daniel's voice had the particular quality it took on when he was presenting information he considered significant. The certification letter, the email, the security footage, All three surfaced within 48 hours of the fire fully formed, requiring no investigation to locate. In 11 years of covering financial crime and public corruption, she said she had never seen evidence materialize that cleanly that fast, unless it had been staged in advance. Something shifted in my chest, not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. "She's smart," I said. "She's very smart," Daniel agreed. She also pulled Hale's docket history. Judge Leonard Hale assigned to the civil proceedings. She looked at his last 12 cases and found a pattern of accelerated scheduling in cases involving Halpern Development or entities connected to it. 4 cases over 3 years, all pushed through faster than standard procedure, all resolved in the developer's favor. He paused. She asked me one question before she hung up. She asked whether I thought the story was already written before it started. "What did you tell her?" "I told her to keep pulling the thread." I looked out my kitchen window at the gray November yard. Carol had planted that oak tree the spring, before she got sick, in the far corner where the afternoon light was best. It was bare now, its branches dark against a pale sky. "Can we trust her?" I asked. "We don't have to trust her," Daniel said. "We just have to let her do her job. If the evidence points where I think it points, she'll find it independently. That's better than us handing it to her directly." He was right. He was almost always right in the operational sense. That evening, Daniel received a message from an unknown number. He read it to me over the phone slowly. 3 sentences. "I worked data at Bennett Fire Safety. I was let go 8 days after the fire. I have recordings you need to hear." The silence on the line between us lasted several seconds. "Laura Davis," Daniel said. "She wants to meet in person. Somewhere public enough that she feels safe, private enough that no one follows the conversation." My chest tightened with something that was not quite hope, but was moving in that direction. The same feeling I got at a scene when the smoke began to clear, and the structure beneath it started to show itself. "Set it up," I said. "Whatever she needs. Before I tell you what Laura Davis had been hiding since the night she was fired, comment the number 10 below so I know you're still with me. Because what she carried out of that office in her bag is about to change everything." Heads up, this story includes some dramatized elements for storytelling and educational purposes. Names and details have been changed, but what this family story reveals about loyalty and family betrayal is something worth hearing to the end. She had chosen the parking garage on 5th Street because the cameras on level 3 had been broken for 6 months. Daniel told me this afterward, and the details stayed with me, not just because it showed she had done her research, but because it told me something about how frightened she was and how determined she was anyway. Those two things do not always go together. When they do, you pay attention. Daniel met her alone. I had offered to come, and he had refused firmly and without discussion. "She reached out to me," he said. "If she sees a stranger, she might not get out of the car." So I waited at home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold, watching the clock the way I had watched too many clocks in the past 3 weeks. He called me at 11:47 p.m. "I have it," he said. His voice was controlled, but underneath the control was something I had not heard from Daniel in a long time. The particular quality of a man who has just seen something that changed the shape of a case completely. "I'm coming to you now." Laura Davis had been the data manager at Bennett Fire Safety for 2.5 years. She was 34 years old, meticulous by training and by temperament, the kind of employee who maintained backup copies of everything, not because she was told to, but because she understood that data without redundancy was data waiting to disappear. Vanessa had hired her for exactly those qualities, and then when those same qualities became inconvenient, had tried to use them against her. 8 days after the fire, Vanessa had called Laura into the office and told her to delete the revision history on the Halpern Heights project file. Not archive it, not restrict access. Delete it, the complete record of every change made to the certification and documents, every timestamp, every user ID associated with each edit. Laura had said no. She had said no clearly in front of 2 other employees. And then she had gone back to her desk and immediately created an encrypted backup of the entire Halpern Heights file directory on a personal drive she kept in her bag. She had the backup in her possession before Vanessa called her back into the office that afternoon and terminated her employment for what was described in the termination letter as unauthorized disclosure of proprietary client information. She had gone to the Columbus Police Department the following week. She had asked to speak with the detective handling the Halpern Heights investigation. She had explained who she was and what she had been asked to delete. The detective, not Detective Mora, a different one. Someone covering the desk that afternoon had taken her contact information, told her someone would follow up, and never called back. By that point, Arthur Bennett had already been named publicly as the subject of the investigation, and a terminated employee from the company bearing his name was not a priority. 2 weeks later, she noticed the car. It was a dark blue sedan she did not recognize, parked across from her apartment building 3 mornings in a row. The third morning, she had left for work 30 minutes earlier than usual and taken a different route, and the car had not been there when she returned. That evening, she stayed at her sister's house in Worthington. She had been rotating between her apartment, her sister's place, and a friend's couch ever since, and she had not told anyone, including her sister, why. Daniel laid all of this out for me at my kitchen table, the drive sitting between us, and I listened, without interrupting the way he had listened to me 3 weeks ago. When he finished, I looked at the drive for a moment, a small black rectangle no larger than my thumb, containing whatever was left of the evidence Vanessa had tried to erase. "What's on it?" I asked. Daniel opened his laptop and plugged it in. There were 3 categories of files. The first was the revision history Vanessa had ordered, deleted a complete record, showing that the Halpern Heights safety certification document had been edited 14 times over a 6-day period, with the final version, the one bearing what appeared to be my signature, saved at 11:22 p.m. on a Tuesday night by a user account registered to Ethan Bennett. The second was a series of internal emails between Vanessa and a contact listed only as HD Legal, which Daniel believed referred to Halpern Development's legal department, discussing the certification timeline and the need to manage the signatory issue before the building's opening date. The third was an audio file, 41 minutes long, recorded during what appeared to be an internal company meeting approximately 3 weeks before the fire. Daniel pressed play. Vanessa's voice filled my kitchen, clear and precise and completely certain of itself, the way it had been the night she sat on my sofa and talked about 61 employees and the families who depended on them. "If Arthur won't sign, we use his old signature. After the fire, people will believe the old man wanted to prove he still mattered." Then Ethan's voice, quieter, tighter, the voice of a man who already knew the answer to his own question and was asking it anyway. "What if someone dies?" A pause. 4 seconds, maybe 5. I counted them. "If you don't do this, we lose the house, the company, and go to prison for the earlier filings. Your choice." Ethan's breathing audible on the recording. "Don't let this touch Emma." Vanessa without hesitation. "Then do exactly what I said." Daniel stopped the playback. My hands were flat on the table, pressed down hard, and I became aware of them only because the wood beneath them was warm and solid and real in a way that I needed right then. My throat had locked completely and my eyes were burning, and I breathed through it slowly, the way I had breathed through 100 situations where feeling the full weight of something would have cost me my ability to function. My son had asked what would happen if someone died. He had asked, and then he had done it anyway. Ohio Revised Code 293352. Daniel said quietly, "One-party consent. Laura was present in that meeting. The recording is legal and it's admissible." He looked at me steadily. "This is enough to take to a lawyer, Arthur. The right kind of lawyer." I nodded once. My voice, when it came, was steady. "Get me a name," I said. Daniel came to the house at midnight with the drive and his laptop, and we sat at my kitchen table and listened to the recording together. I had already heard it once over the phone, Daniel holding his cell up to the speaker in his car in a parking garage on 5th Street. But hearing it through speakers in my own kitchen, with the November rain coming down outside and the overhead light making everything look too sharp and too clear, that was different. That was the kind of different that stays with you. We listened to all 41 minutes. The first 20 were operational. Vanessa walking through project timelines, subcontractor schedules, the certification gap that needed to be resolved before the building's opening date. Her voice was the same voice she had used in my living room 6 weeks ago, the one that sounded like a board meeting and felt like a closing door. Ethan spoke occasionally, asking clarifying questions, his tone careful and flat, in the way of someone performing composure he did not feel. Then, at the 23rd minute, the conversation shifted and I heard my own name come out of my daughter-in-law's mouth, the way you hear something in a nightmare, familiar and entirely wrong. I had already heard this recording once in a parking garage over a phone pressed against a car speaker. I had thought that meant I was ready. I was not ready. Sitting in my own kitchen under my own light, with the rain coming down outside and Daniel 3 feet away, the words landed differently. The first time they had been information I needed to absorb. This time, they were something I had to sit inside and breathe through, and they were heavier than anything I had carried out of a burning building. When Ethan's voice came through the speakers asking his question, I pressed both palms flat against the table and held them there. 4 seconds of silence before her answer. I counted them again. They were still 4 seconds. They would always be 4 seconds, and they would always contain what they contained. When Emma's name came, I closed my eyes. When the recording ended, Daniel closed the laptop. The rain was louder now, hitting the kitchen window in uneven bursts. I became aware that I had been gripping the edge of the table with both hands for the last several minutes, and I made myself let go. Made myself press my palms flat against my thighs. Made myself breathe in and out, with the deliberateness of a man who understood that the next several minutes required him to think clearly. My son had known. He had sat in a room and heard a plan that would put innocent people at risk, and he had asked one question, and the answer had not been good enough to make him walk out. Emma's name on that recording, "Don't let this touch." Emma cracked something open in my chest that I did not have a word for. Not anger, not grief. Something that lived underneath both of those in the place where love and devastation occupy the same space simultaneously. "Arthur," Daniel's voice was quiet but direct. "I need to know you're with me." I looked up at him. His gray eyes were steady and patient, the eyes of a man who had delivered difficult findings to difficult people for 3 decades and understood that the human response to truth was not always immediate. "I'm with you," I said. My voice came out rough but certain. 11 people are dead, Daniel. Whatever I feel about Ethan, whatever I feel about any of this, it doesn't change what happened in that building." Daniel nodded once. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a business card on the table between us. Rachel Monroe, Monroe Legal Group, former Assistant U.S. Attorney, Southern District of Ohio. White-collar crime and public corruption. "She's the best I know for this," Daniel said. "She spent 15 years putting people exactly like Vanessa in federal court. She'll know what the recording is worth, and she'll know what to do with the rest of it." He tapped the card once with one finger. "But Arthur, she's going to tell you things about this case that are harder than what you've already heard. You need to be ready for that." I picked up the card. The paper was heavy and plain. No flourishes, just the name and the number, the kind of card that belonged to someone who let the work speak instead. I called Rachel Monroe at 7 the following morning. She answered on the second ring, and before I had finished the first 2 sentences of my explanation, she said, "Mr. Bennett, I've been following this case. Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." For the first time in 3 weeks, I felt something that was not the managed numbness of a man holding himself together by sheer discipline. I felt cautiously and carefully, like the ground might be solid after all. Rachel Monroe's office was on the 14th floor of a building on South High Street, and the view from her conference room looked out over the Scioto River in a way that I suspected she never noticed, because she was always looking at the table. She was 52 years old, compact and precise, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a habit of tapping her pen against her legal pad when she was thinking that I recognized within the first 10 minutes as a tell it meant she had found something and was deciding how to say it. She had spent 15 years as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of Ohio before leaving to open her own practice, and she carried the particular quality of someone who had spent a decade and a half in federal court, learning exactly how people hid things and exactly how to find them again. She had read the full file before I arrived. She had listened to the recording twice. "The audio is clean," she said, setting her pen down flat on the table, which I was already learning meant she had finished thinking and was ready to speak. "Ohio Revised Code 293352. Laura Davis was a participant in that meeting. One-party consent. Every word on that recording is admissible in a state or federal proceeding." She looked at me directly. "The revision history is better. It shows exactly who made the final edit to that certification document at exactly what time, from exactly what account. That is not circumstantial evidence. That is a timestamp with a name attached." "What about Delaney?" I asked. "The camera footage from Sentinel Systems is solid. Daniel's methodology in obtaining it was clean. He didn't breach any access restrictions. He requested a backup copy through a legitimate channel." She opened a second folder. "What I need now is the connection between Delaney and Vanessa. Employment records, payment records, any direct communication. That link closes the loop. She had already started working on the judge. Judge Leonard Hale was a county circuit court judge with jurisdiction over both the Halpern Heights civil proceedings and, as we discovered, my own criminal case, an assignment that should have triggered a conflict disclosure but never did, 3 weeks after the fire, which Rachel described as moving at a speed I have never seen in a civil docket of this complexity. Hale sat in the criminal division of the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, the court with jurisdiction over felony charges exactly like the ones filed against me. His position gave him authority over precisely the kind of case Vanessa needed controlled, and he had been in place long before the building burned. "I can't access his personal financial records directly," she said. "That requires a subpoena, which requires probable cause, which requires something I can take to a federal judge." She tapped her pen once. "But I don't have to. Carol Stanton does." Carol had called Rachel the previous afternoon. She had been working through Ohio Secretary of State business registrations and Franklin County property records, all public, all accessible, all the kind of documents that investigators overlooked, because they were unglamorous and required patience to read. She had found a limited liability company called Meridian Advisory Group, registered to an address in Upper Arlington. The registered agent was a man named Paul Hale, Judge Leonard Hale's brother. Meridian Advisory Group had received a wire transfer of $250,000 from a shell company connected to Vanessa's corporate network dated 31 days before the Halpern Heights fire. Meridian Advisory Group had no website, no listed clients, and no public record of any advisory activity whatsoever. I sat with that for a moment. My jaw was tight and my hands were still on the table, and I was running the sequence in my head. The certification, the fire, the evidence that appeared too quickly, the docket moving too fast, and underneath all of it, a wire transfer to a company with no purpose except to receive it. "She's going to publish?" I asked. "Not yet," Rachel said. "I asked her to hold until we have enough for a federal referral. If this goes public before we're ready, Hale has time to move money, and Vanessa has time to disappear." She looked at me steadily. "We do this in the right order, Arthur, or we risk losing pieces of it." She referred the case to the FBI field office on Lizelle Road that afternoon. Wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1343, bribery of a public official under 18 U.S.C. 201, and conspiracy under 18 U.S.C. 371. The agent assigned to the case was a woman named Special Agent Diane Cole, 12 years in the Financial Crimes Unit, who called Rachel back within 2 hours. Rachel called me that evening. "The FBI is in," she said. "They're opening a parallel investigation. Cole's team is going to pull Hale's financials through federal subpoena, and they're going to run Delaney's employment and payment records through Halpern Development's filings." She paused. "There's one more thing. Cole wants us to hold our position through the trial. Don't tip anything. Let Hale run the proceedings the way he's been planning to run them. Let him make his rulings on the record. Let him shut down our evidence requests. Let him do exactly what Vanessa is paying him to do. Every ruling he makes in that courtroom becomes part of the federal case against him." I understood the strategy. Let the trap close itself. "How long?" I asked. "The trial is in 6 weeks, Rachel said. "We hold for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sitting in that house with the red paint fading on my front door, and my name removed from the recognition board and 11 people in the ground. 6 weeks of letting people believe what they had been told to believe." "Fine," I said. 6 weeks. Rachel paused, then added quietly, "There's one more thing I need from you, Arthur. Something that can't come from a database or a subpoena." She let a beat pass. "Emma spends time with you. Is there anything she's mentioned about her parents' associates, people who came to the house, anyone connected to the case that you haven't thought to consider?" I told her I would think about it. 3 days later, Emma answered the question herself. Emma arrived on a Saturday morning with her backpack and her drawing supplies and the particular energy of a 10-year-old who had decided without consulting anyone that today was going to be a good day. I had not seen her in 5 weeks. The last time had been a brief handoff in a parking lot, Ethan dropping her off for an afternoon before any of this started, back when the worst thing I knew about my son was that his company was struggling. She had grown the way children do, in increments you only notice when you have been away from them long enough. Her hair was longer. She was wearing sneakers I did not recognize. She walked into my house like she owned it, which she always had, dropped her backpack by the door, and immediately went to the kitchen to investigate what I had available for breakfast. "You only have eggs and bread," she announced, opening and closing the refrigerator with the authority of someone conducting an official inspection. "I have eggs and bread," I confirmed. "I can make toast." "I'll make the eggs," she said, already pulling the stool up to the counter. "You always make them too dry." She was not wrong about that. Carol had always made the eggs. We spent the morning the way we usually did, Emma drawing at the kitchen table, while I read, occasionally showing me whatever she was working on and asking questions that ranged from sensible to completely unpredictable. She asked why trees lost their leaves. She asked whether I had ever been scared inside a burning building. She asked if I thought her teacher was being unfair about a homework assignment involving fractions. I answered all of them as honestly as I could. After lunch, she spread her colored pencils across the table, in the particular arrangement she always used, organized by color family, which she had been doing since she was 6, and started a new drawing, a horse from the looks of it, though Emma's horses tended to evolve into something more imaginative before she finished. She worked for a while without speaking, her tongue pressed slightly to her upper lip, the way she did when she was concentrating. Then, without looking up from the paper, she said, "Grandpa, why weren't you at Thanksgiving this year?" I had been expecting some version of this question. I had prepared an answer that was honest, without being more than she needed to carry. "Your dad and I had a disagreement," I said. "Grown-up stuff. We're working through it." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Mom said you were sick." "I'm not sick," I said, keeping my voice even. "That's what I thought," Emma said, with the flat certainty of a child who had already decided not to believe something. She added blue to the horse's mane, deliberate strokes. "Judge Hale said you were sick too, at dinner." I became very still. "When was this?" I asked. My voice came out the same as before I made sure of it. "Christmas last year," she said. "He came for dinner. He and Mom talked for a really long time after Dad went to bed." She looked up briefly. "He seemed nice, but he ate too much of the roast." She went back to her drawing. I looked at my granddaughter, her bent head, her careful pencil strokes, the complete and genuine innocence of what she had just said, and I felt the pieces lock into place with a precision that was almost physical, like a deadbolt sliding home. Hale had been in Vanessa's house at Christmas, almost a full year before the fire, not introduced through the case, not brought in after the fact, but present at a family dinner, talking with Vanessa after Ethan went to bed. He was not a judge who had been compromised. He was a co-architect who had been in position long before the building burned. Emma held up the drawing. The horse had acquired wings. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think it's perfect," I said. My voice was steady. My hands under the table were not. I waited until Emma was asleep on the couch that afternoon before I called Rachel. She picked up on the first ring. "Hale was at Vanessa's house for Christmas dinner last year," I said. My granddaughter mentioned it. She had no idea what she was saying. There was a pause on the other end. When Rachel spoke, her voice had the particular controlled intensity of someone who had just watched a case change shape. "That moves us from bribery to conspiracy," she said. "He wasn't recruited after the fact, Arthur. He was part of the plan." Another pause. "I'm calling Cole tonight." I looked through the doorway at Emma, asleep with her drawing still in her hand, the winged horse pressed against her chest. She had no idea what she had just done. I was up before 5 on the morning of the trial, not because I could not sleep. I had slept solidly and without dreams, the way I had learned to sleep before difficult shifts in my first years on the job. The body, if you treat it right, will rest when it needs to, even if the mind has other ideas. I was up because there were things I wanted to do slowly without rushing, and I wanted the time to do them right. I showered. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes in the quiet of the February morning and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill I had developed across 37 years of waiting for bells to ring. Then I went to the closet and took out the suit. It was the same dark navy suit I had worn to my retirement ceremony 4 years ago. Carol had picked it out. She had always had better judgment about those things than I did, and I had learned early in our marriage to defer to her on questions of appearance. It still fit. The dry cleaner had pressed it 2 days ago, and it hung clean and exact on its hanger. I dressed carefully, the white shirt, the plain dark tie, the shoes I had polished myself the night before, until I could see a version of my face in them. Each thing in its place, each thing done right. The badge was last. I took it from the velvet box on the dresser and held it for a moment. The metal was warm from the indoor air, its surface worn and darkened in the way of something that had been handled for decades. There was a small scratch along the lower left edge from a night 20 years ago when I had crawled through a collapsed ceiling and the badge had caught on a nail. I had never had it repaired. It seemed important somehow to let it carry its history. I pinned it to the left lapel, exactly where it had always been. Pat Mills was standing on my front step when I opened the door, holding 2 cups from the diner on Broadview Avenue. She was wearing her good coat, the charcoal one she saved for occasions, and her expression was the same one she had worn the night she showed up with chicken soup. Completely certain, completely decided. "I'll be in that courtroom," she said, handing me a cup. "Front row left side." My throat tightened. "Pat, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said firmly in the tone she had probably used on 30 years of middle schoolers. "Drink your coffee. We're going to be late." The drive downtown took 20 minutes. I parked in the structure on Civic Center Drive and walked the 2 blocks to the courthouse alone, the February air sharp enough to sting. The crowd outside was larger than I had expected. News vans on both sides of the street, cameras on tripods, people with signs I did not let myself read. Across the plaza on the opposite side of the entrance, Frank DeLuca was standing with a piece of poster board held in both hands. He had made the sign himself, the letters slightly uneven and absolutely legible, 37 years. He never left anyone behind. He caught my eye and gave me a single nod. I nodded back. I was almost to the entrance when I saw them. Jimmy Reyes's parents were standing at the edge of the crowd, away from the signs and the cameras. His father was a broad-shouldered man, in his 60s, wearing a brown jacket. His mother stood beside him, her hands folded in front of her. They were not holding signs. They were not shouting. They were simply standing there watching me walk toward the courthouse doors. I stopped. I looked at them, and they looked at me, and I felt the weight of everything that connected us. Their son, my student, the building, the 11 names settle across my shoulders like something I had been carrying for months and would carry for the rest of my life. Jimmy's father gave me a slow, deliberate nod. I nodded back, and my vision blurred for just a moment, and I breathed through it and kept walking. Rachel was waiting inside the doors. She looked at my face and then at the badge on my lapel, and she said simply, "Ready?" "Yes," I said, and I was. Every time I looked up from the defense table, they were there. Jimmy Reyes's parents, row 3 left side, the same seats every morning. His father in the brown jacket. His mother with her hands folded in her lap. They arrived before the gallery opened, and they stayed until the bailiff cleared the room. They did not speak to me. They did not need to. Their presence was a statement that required no translation. They were there because the truth mattered, and they intended to watch until they saw it. The prosecution opened on day 1 with the 3 pieces of evidence I had been living with for 3 months. The certification letter with my signature, the email from my account, the security footage from Ethan's office building. The assistant prosecutor was a careful, methodical man named Garrett Howell, who presented each item with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed the case was already won. He spoke about me in the third person throughout, as though I were not sitting 8 feet away, and described my actions with a clinical precision that would have been impressive if any of it had been true. The cognitive decline testimony came on day 2. The expert witness was a forensic psychologist named Dr. Warren Briggs, who Rachel had already established been referred to the prosecution by a colleague of Vanessa's from a previous case. He had never met me. He had never evaluated me. He had reviewed a file prepared by the prosecution and Vanessa's legal team, and had constructed from that file a portrait of a man whose judgment had become dangerously unreliable in the years following his retirement. Rachel cross-examined him for 40 minutes. She was not aggressive. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked questions with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years in federal court, learning exactly where the architecture of a weak argument had its load-bearing walls. "Dr. Briggs," she said, standing at the podium with her legal pad face down in front of her, a deliberate choice I realized showing the jury she did not need notes. "How many times have you met with Mr. Bennett in person?" Briggs shifted slightly. I reviewed the case file provided. "In person, Dr. Briggs. How many times?" "I haven't conducted an in-person evaluation at this stage." "So, your testimony about Mr. Bennett's cognitive state is based entirely on a file assembled by the party that retained you." She did not phrase it as a question. She let it sit. Briggs began to explain the methodology of file-based assessment, and Rachel let him talk for 30 seconds before asking her next question, which concerned the specific psychological assessment instruments used their validated applications, and whether any of them had been designed for use without direct patient contact. By the time she was finished, Briggs was speaking more carefully and more quietly than he had been, and two members of the jury were writing things down. Hale sustained every objection the prosecution raised during Rachel's cross. He interrupted her 3 times with procedural corrections that were, as far as I could determine, without precedent in the rulings he had made in the preceding 2 days. He denied her motion to introduce the Sentinel Systems camera, back up on grounds of chain of custody, a ruling Rachel accepted without argument, because we were not ready to use that evidence yet, and she knew it. She noted every ruling in the record, every interruption, every sustained objection. S.A. is a circuit court judge. Hale had authority over both the civil and criminal docket, a dual role Rachel had flagged to the presiding judge weeks earlier as a potential conflict of interest without response. He was building a parallel document, a map of Hale's conduct across 3 days of testimony, and every entry on that map was going to matter. On the evening of day 2, she called me. "He's making it worse for himself," she said. "Every time he shuts me down on the financial evidence, he's creating a record of suppression. Cole's team is watching the transcript in real time." A pause. "How are you holding up?" I looked out the kitchen window at the February dark. "I'm holding," I said. "One more day of this," Rachel said. "Then it's our turn." Day 3 was the prosecution's final witnesses, 2 former Bennett Fire Safety employees who testified that I had pressured Ethan to approve projects that were not fully compliant. Rachel dismantled the first one in 12 minutes by producing his termination letter, signed by Vanessa, which cited performance issues predating any contact with me. The second witness grew visibly uncomfortable under questioning and ultimately conceded that he had not personally witnessed any conversation between me and Ethan about the Halpern project. At 4:50 p.m., Howell stood and announced that the prosecution rested. Hale looked at his watch, then at me, with the particular expression of a man who believed he was about to close a door permanently. "We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., he said, "at which point I will also be hearing the prosecution's motion for pretrial asset restriction, the request to limit Mr. Bennett's ability to manage his financial holdings, pending resolution of the criminal matter." He paused, letting that land. "And I expect to move toward a ruling on the primary matter shortly thereafter." He did not look at Jimmy's parents when he said it. I did. Jimmy's father was watching Hale with an expression I recognized, the expression of a man who had been patient for a very long time and was prepared to be patient a little longer because he understood that the truth moved at its own speed. That night, Rachel called again, her voice carrying the particular controlled intensity I had learned to associate with things she did not want to say over the phone. "Tomorrow," she said. "Everything happens tomorrow, Arthur." I set the phone down and sat in my kitchen in the February quiet, and I thought about a badge with a scratch along the lower left edge and a notebook in a breast pocket and nearly 4 decades of walking toward what other people ran from. Tomorrow. Before I show you what Arthur did when the judge ordered him to remove that badge and open court, comment the number 16 below, because what happens in the next few minutes will change everything you thought you knew about this case. This story includes dramatized elements for entertainment and educational purposes. If this kind of storytelling isn't for you, this is a good place to step away, no judgment. For those staying, hold on tight. Hale took the bench at 9 a.m. on the 4th day and looked at me, the way he had been looking at me since the trial began, with the particular contempt of a man who believed he had already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Rachel and I had spoken for an hour the previous evening. She had walked me through what was going to happen in what order and what I needed to do at each step. I had listened without interrupting, the way I had listened to incident briefings for 37 years, filing each piece in sequence, so that when the moment came, I would not have to think, I would simply act. Howell rose first, presenting the pretrial asset restriction motion, a request to limit my ability to manage my financial holdings, on the grounds that I represented a flight risk and a danger to the integrity of the proceedings. He spoke for 12 minutes. Hale listened with an attention that was noticeably warmer than anything he had directed at Rachel across 3 days of testimony. Rachel stood to respond. Hale interrupted her 40 seconds, inciting a procedural point that Rachel acknowledged and worked around without breaking stride. She presented 3 counter-arguments, each grounded in Ohio case law, each delivered with the flat precision of someone who had made these arguments before and knew exactly where they landed. Hale sustained the motion anyway. He did it quickly without extended comment and moved immediately to what he called final evidentiary considerations before ruling on the primary criminal matter. He looked at his notes, he looked at the courtroom, and then he looked at my chest. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I have observed throughout these proceedings that you have chosen to wear your former department badge in this courtroom." I met his eyes and said nothing, because Rachel had told me to let him finish. "That badge represents an institution." Hale continued, leaning forward slightly over the bench. "It represents a public trust that the evidence in this case suggests you violated in the most serious possible way. With 11 people dead and their families present in this gallery, I find it inappropriate. I find it frankly offensive for you to continue displaying that symbol as though it were a shield." He straightened. "I am ordering you to remove it and surrender it to the court clerk. Now." The room went very quiet. Pat Mills' front row left, pressed her lips together so hard they went white. Frank DeLuca, 3 rows back, gripped the edge of the gallery railing with both hands. Jimmy's parents, row 3, watched without moving. I stood up slowly. I reached up to my left lapel and unclasped the badge. I held it in my palm for a moment. The worn metal, the scratch along the lower left edge, the weight of 37 years, and a piece of bronze the size of my thumb. Then I walked to the evidence table at the front of the room. But instead of placing it face up for the clerk, I turned it over and held it up so the jury could see the back. Every badge issued by the Columbus Fire Department carries a unique registration code stamped into the metal, I said. "Mine is 4197. It has been 4197 for 37 years. I set it on the evidence table. The prosecution's security footage shows a man entering that building wearing a badge. I would ask the court to look at the number on that badge, the number the prosecution has been asking this jury to connect to my name." Hale's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Bennett, you were ordered to surrender." "Your Honor." Rachel was already on her feet. "I request that the court display the security footage submitted by the prosecution, specifically the timestamp at 11:43 p.m. at maximum resolution." The footage appeared on the courtroom monitor. The man in the dark jacket, the familiar coat, the cane. Rachel had the clerk freeze the frame and zoom to the badge visible at the man's hip. The number was small but legible. "My badge is on that table," I said. 4197. The man in that footage is wearing 4172. Those are 2 different numbers, 2 different badges, and 2 different men. "Badge number 4172, Rachel said. Facing the room was issued to a former Columbus firefighter named Mark Delaney, terminated 3 years ago for theft of departmental equipment. Mr. Delaney is currently employed as a private security contractor whose sole registered client is Halpern Development Group. Chief Roy Callahan of the Columbus Fire Department confirmed this through the department's personnel database at our request." The gallery erupted. Hale slammed his gavel, his face draining of color, his voice rising over the noise. "This has not been properly submitted as evidence. I am striking this from the record. Ms. Monroe, you are in contempt. Your Honor." Rachel's voice did not rise. It dropped, which was somehow worse. "I have one more item." She pressed play on the audio system. Vanessa's voice filled the courtroom, the same voice I had heard in my kitchen months ago, the same measured certainty now amplified through courtroom speakers for 300 people to hear at once. She spoke about my signature, about the fire, about what people would believe afterward. Ethan's voice followed, quieter and tighter, asking the question that had haunted me since the night Daniel pressed play at my kitchen table. Then her answer, 4 seconds of silence before it, and then the conditions, and then Emma's name, and then the instruction. Every word exactly as I remembered it. The gallery did not move. The jury did not move. Even Howell, the assistant prosecutor, who had spent 3 days presenting his case against me, stopped writing. Rachel stopped the playback. In the silence that followed, she laid 3 additional documents on the evidence table. The revision history, showing Ethan's user account, making the final edit to the certification document at 11:22 p.m. the wire transfer records connecting Vanessa's shell company to Meridian Advisory Group, and the email chain between Vanessa and HD Legal, discussing the need to manage the signatory issue. Hale was on his feet, gavel raised face, a mottled, terrible red. "I am declaring a recess. I am striking everything Ms. Monroe has introduced in the last 10 minutes from the record. This evidence has not been properly authenticated, and I will not allow this courtroom to be used as a platform for Rachel turned toward the rear of the courtroom and gave a single nod. The doors opened. 3 people in dark suits entered. The one in the center walked directly to the court clerk's desk and placed a document face up on the surface, a federal arrest warrant, signed by a United States District Court judge the previous evening. The clerk looked at it. Then she looked at the bench. The agent in the center held up her credential wallet, a federal badge, gold and unmistakable. Special Agent Diane Cole, FBI Financial Crimes Unit. We have federal warrants for the arrest of Leonard Hale, Vanessa Bennett, and Mark Delaney on charges of bribery of a public official wire fraud and conspiracy under federal statute. She addressed the bench directly, her voice carrying without effort. Judge Hale, pursuant to the warrant filed with this court's clerk, I am asking you to step down from the bench. Hale's gavel hit the floor. He had dropped it. His hands were shaking so badly he had simply dropped it, and it clattered off the edge of the bench and bounced once on the floor below. And the sound of it was the most complete thing I had heard in months. I stood at the evidence table with my badge in my hand, and I watched Leonard Hale step down from the bench he had used to bury me, and I felt something move through my chest that was not triumph and was not relief, and was not quite any word I know. It was the feeling of a structure that has been burning, finally stopping. The gavel was still rolling across the floor when the courtroom came apart. Agent Cole's team moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had planned this moment carefully and had no interest in drama for its own sake. 2 agents went directly to the bench. Hale backed away from them, with his hands raised, his face the color of old ash, his mouth working around words that did not fully form, something about jurisdiction, something about immunity, the instinctive legal vocabulary of a man who had spent decades hiding behind procedure and was reaching for it now, out of pure reflex. It did not help him. The agents were polite and absolutely immovable, and within 30 seconds, Leonard Hale's hands were behind his back, and the gallery was on its feet, and the noise in the room had become something shapeless and enormous. I had watched buildings collapse. I had stood at perimeters and watched floors give and walls fold inward, and structures that had seemed permanent become in the span of seconds something entirely different. What I was watching now felt like that, not a physical collapse, but something that operated by the same principles. A load-bearing element failing. Everything suspended above it coming down at once. Vanessa moved fast. She was on her feet before Hale had finished his retreat from the bench, heading for the side door with the focused speed of someone who had mentally rehearsed this exit, who had always known somewhere beneath the confidence and the planning that there was a version of this day where she needed to leave quickly. She had her hand on the door handle before the second pair of agents reached her. They were not rough. They did not need to be. One agent stepped in front of the door, and the other took her arm with the matter-of-fact firmness of someone performing a task they had performed before, and that was sufficient. Vanessa stopped. Her hand fell from the handle. She stood very still for a moment, her back to the room, and I watched her shoulders rise once with a sharp, controlled breath. Then she turned around. For the first time since I had known her, since the evening she had sat on my sofa, with her hands folded in her lap and her posture absolutely perfect, she had nothing to say. No framing, no recontextualization, no way to present what was happening as something other than what it was. The machinery that had been running behind her eyes through every conversation I had ever had with her had simply stopped. She looked at Ethan. What came next was not calculation. It was survival, raw and graceless, the thing underneath all the polish finally showing itself. He signed the original document, she said, her voice carrying clearly over the chaos. She raised her arm and pointed directly at Ethan, her composure completely gone. Ethan signed the certification first. He hired Delaney. He agreed to close the valve. I handled the business side. The building's safety systems were his operational responsibility, not mine. He was the one with the license. He was the one with the credentials. The agents beside her exchanged a brief look, but did not interrupt. In their line of work, people talking in moments like this was not a problem. It was evidence. Ethan had been standing at the plaintiff's table, very still, watching his wife. His face had been doing something complicated for the last several minutes. The expression of a man watching the thing he had feared most finally arrive and finding it both worse and simpler than he had imagined. When Vanessa's arm extended toward him, something in his expression collapsed entirely, the way a wall collapses when the thing it has been bracing against finally pushes through. His voice cracked down the middle like green wood. She planned everything. He wasn't looking at Vanessa anymore. He was looking at the floor, then at Rachel, then slowly, the way a man turns towards something he knows is going to hurt him, at me. From the beginning, the signature Delaney, the valve, she laid all of it out. She arranged the money. She told me what to sign and when, and what to say if anyone asked. His throat worked visibly. His eyes were filling, and he pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, breathing hard through his nose, fighting to hold himself together. I didn't know it was going to go that far. She said it was going to be contained. She said nobody was going to get hurt. I didn't know people were going to... He could not finish the sentence. Vanessa's voice cut across the room. Don't you dare stand there and pretend you didn't know what you were agreeing to. You sat in that meeting. You heard every word. You asked your question and you got your answer, and you stayed in the room. Her voice pitched higher, the control she had maintained for months, cracking along every seam at once. You signed, you hired, you knew. I trusted you, Ethan said, and the words came out broken and raw and entirely without dignity. You told me we had no other choice. You told me it was the only way. You are a grown man, Vanessa said, her voice dropping back to something colder. You made choices. Own them. The agents had reached Ethan by then. He did not resist. He let them take his arms with the passivity of someone who had been waiting for something to end for a very long time and felt in some terrible way relieved that the waiting was over. His whole body seemed to release a tension it had been holding since long before this courtroom, since long before the fire. But before they moved him, he turned and looked at me. Dad. His voice was barely audible over the noise. The agents paused not from kindness, but from the professional understanding that a man saying one word to his father was not a security risk. His eyes were wet, and his face was broken open in a way I had not seen since he was a child, since the hospital corridor outside Carol's room, since the last time he had needed me to be a father, and not just a man standing in judgment. Dad, I never wanted it to go this far. I need you to know that. I looked at my son. I had been looking at him for 40 years. I had looked at him when he was 3 days old, and I was holding him in a hospital room and understanding for the first time what it meant to be responsible for something that could not protect itself. I had looked at him at his mother's funeral, standing beside me in a suit slightly too large, holding himself together with everything he had. I had looked at him across my own coffee table 8 months ago, his knuckles pale and his eyes desperate, asking me to sign a document that would have put 800 people in a building I knew was not safe. I thought about 7 words on a folded piece of paper, in a book on a shelf, the only warning he had been able to manage, the only courage he had been able to find. I thought about Jimmy Reyes with his notebook in the apparatus bay, asking questions designed to understand rather than impress, writing down the answers because he cared about getting things right. A boy in a brown jacket who had asked every right question and trusted the wrong building. I thought about 11 people who had not come home. I know you didn't, I said. My voice came out low and even. But, Ethan, 11 people did not get to decide how far it went. They went to sleep in their apartments and trusted that the building was safe, and they died because it wasn't. I held his gaze. I love you. That has not changed. But I cannot give you absolution for this. That is not mine to give. He closed his eyes. 2 tears ran down his face, and he did not wipe them away. And then the agents were moving, and my son was walking toward the side door without looking back. I watched him go. Rachel appeared at my elbow and said nothing, which was exactly right. Jimmy's parents were still in row 3. Jimmy's father was watching the door through which Ethan had just gone, his expression not satisfaction, but something older and quieter, a man who had been carrying a specific weight for 3 months and had just felt it shift, not disappear, simply shift into something he could carry differently. His mother turned and looked at me. When our eyes met, she gave me a single slow nod. The kind that contains everything a sentence would only diminish. I nodded back. I held myself together because there were still people in the room, and the work was not finished. And I had learned across a long career that you stayed functional until the scene was clear. You felt it later when you were alone, but my hands at my sides were trembling. I looked down at them. They had carried people out of burning buildings. They had held Carol's hand at the end. They had signed 37 years of inspection reports and 1 check for $80,000 written to a son I had trusted completely. Now they were trembling, and I let them because some things you earn the right to feel. Rachel put her hand briefly on my arm, one firm, deliberate pressure, and then she was moving toward Agent Cole, managing the next steps with the efficiency that had kept this case alive for 3 months. I stood in the middle of the courtroom with my badge in my hand and looked at the empty bench where Leonard Hale had sat for 3 days, conducting proceedings he had sold before they started. It is over, I thought. Most of it is over. The hardest part I already knew was just beginning. 6 weeks after the trial, all criminal charges against me were formally dismissed. Rachel called me on a Thursday morning to tell me, and I was standing in the kitchen making eggs, making them too dry the way I always did. And I listened to her read the official language of the dismissal order, and I said thank you. And I meant it more than those 2 words are usually asked to carry. The Ohio probate court dismissed Ethan's conservatorship petition 4 days later, citing the arrest and pending criminal prosecution of the petitioner. The civil proceedings related to Halpern Heights continued in a separate docket, considerably more complicated now by the federal investigation, but none of that involved my name as a defendant anymore. I was not on trial. I was free. I did not feel the way I had expected to feel. I had imagined in the months of waiting that the dismissal would arrive like a door opening a sudden release of pressure, a breath finally drawn fully. Instead, it arrived like the end of a long physical effort, the kind where you have been carrying something heavy for so long that when you set it down, your arms are still in the shape of carrying. The weight was gone. The posture remained. The sorrow remained. 11 people were still dead. Jimmy Reyes was still gone. No legal outcome was ever going to make it otherwise. I understood that with a completeness that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with knowing that some things once broken stay broken. You work around them. You build something in the space they leave, but you do not pretend they are not there. What I wanted was my badge back. Callahan brought it himself on a Wednesday afternoon, in late March, driving over from the main station in his personal car. He came in through the back door, the way people do when they know a house well enough not to use the front, and he sat at my kitchen table and put the evidence envelope between us. "They offered to issue you a new one," he said, watching me carefully. "Current design, clean metal." I told them I'd ask. "I want this one," I said. He nodded, opened the envelope, and set the badge on the table. It looked exactly as it always had. The registration code on the back 4197 was still there, the same number that had helped dismantle a conspiracy in a courtroom 4 months ago. Callahan stood and came around the table. He picked up the badge and pinned it to my left lapel, exactly where it had always been, with the careful hands of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding. "I should not have taken your name off that board," he said. He did not look away when he said it, which I respected. "I was given a directive, and I followed it when I should have pushed back. I'm sorry for that, Arthur." "You called me before you did it," I said. That mattered. He nodded once, and that was the end of it, because we were both people who understood that some things were better resolved in a single exchange than extended into something larger than they needed to be. The Bennett Safety Fund opened its doors in April, out of a small office on Morse Road that Daniel had helped me find and Laura had helped me set up. 2 purposes: financial support for families of firefighters killed in the line of duty and free fire safety inspections for low-income residential buildings across Franklin County. Rachel handled the legal structure. Daniel ran the independent investigation arm. Laura built the data system's clean, redundant design so that no one could alter a record without leaving a trace. We were not fixing what had happened at Halpern Heights. Nothing could fix that. We were doing the only thing available to people who have survived something, making sure the ground we stood on going forward was more solid than the ground we had stood on before. The sentencing came in June. Ethan received 18 years reduced from the maximum by a cooperation agreement in exchange for his full testimony against Vanessa and the Halpern development executives. I had not spoken to him since the courtroom. Vanessa received 23 years conspiracy obstruction, witness tampering, and charges related to the deliberate falsification of safety documentation that had contributed to 11 deaths. Her lawyers argued the fire had not been intended to cause casualties. The federal judge noted in his sentencing remarks that the distinction between an intended outcome and a foreseeable one was not, in his view, a meaningful mitigating factor when 11 people were dead. I thought that was right. Leonard Hale lost his judgeship, his pension, and his freedom, 12 years in federal prison. Mark Delaney, who had entered a guilty plea and testified for the prosecution, received 7 years, with the possibility of parole. I stood in the small office on Morse Road on a Tuesday morning in early summer, coffee in hand. Looking at the list of the first families, the fund had been able to assist 4 of them from different parts of the state, all navigating the particular aftermath of loss that comes when someone goes to work and does not come home. On the wall above the desk was a photograph. Jimmy Reyes at his fire academy graduation, in his dress uniform, grinning with the particular pride of someone who has just completed the first step towards something they have wanted for a long time. His mother had given me the photograph when she came to the fund's opening event with a pan of tamales and the same steady presence she had brought to row 3 of the courtroom. He would have wanted to be part of something like this, she said simply. I looked at that photograph every morning. I did not feel finished. I did not think I was supposed to. The work had just begun. A year after the fire, I stood at the memorial beside the families of 11 people who never came home. Jimmy Reyes' nephew, 6 years old, wearing a small paper badge his grandmother had pinned to his jacket, looked up at me and asked if my badge made me a hero. I knelt down to his level. "No," I said. "It just reminds me of a promise I made. Never leave anyone behind. I couldn't keep it the night your uncle died, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure no one else pays for someone else's greed." This is my family story, and I tell it not with pride, but with the full weight of what it cost. Do not do what I did. Do not look away from the truth because you love someone. Family betrayal does not announce itself. It arrives quietly in small decisions made by people you trusted completely. I believe God gives us strength to carry what we cannot put down. I have found that to be true. If this family story stayed with you, if you have ever faced family betrayal and had to choose between love and truth, leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. The stories on this channel contain dramatized elements built for educational purposes. If that is not what you are looking for, we respect your choice completely, and we will see everyone else in the next one.